Good morning, good afternoon, folks. It's me, your curator. Today, I'll be bringing you one of my longer videos discussing the build-up of one of the most pinnacle moments in the TCW universe. I will not directly cover the Unification War, leaving it up to the viewer's imagination to come up with their own events in their mind. But I'll be covering what caused it, and what led up to the whole thing. I'll be discussing that all today. So sit back, relax, just tune in for the video itself, or listen, do what you gotta do. Thanks for joining me. In 2026, mankind would begin its colonization efforts, using drones to help build what was called colonization foundations. They would be established underground due to the moon and Mars not really having a good atmosphere. These would be large underground superstructures and underground cities, and with the invention of the Saturn X, travel to and from Mars would become much easier in 2028. In 2033, the first moon colony would be established and owned by the United States of America. This colony was known as New Phoenix, and was named after the city of Phoenix in Arizona. And the first Martian colony would be called Drion City, was completed 6 years after the first colonization foundation was laid. This would be created by the Asian Pacific Empire, and it was nearly double the size of New Phoenix. Soon those settlements would lay down the foundation for other nations on Earth to begin moving to the moon and Mars, establishing more colonies and settlements. Sometime later, they would begin using Phobos and Deimos for the resources, establishing the Martian Refinery Corporation. Many would call this era the Colonial War, though during most of its lifespan no actual battles were fought. It was just another effort of nations spreading out and doing what they could to set themselves up with the land that was available. Sometimes they'd intentionally deny other nations the land and potential resources that were on those moons. But during the early years, these places were advertised as paradises to visit, whole new worlds beyond the boundaries of just Mars. It became a hot ticket item, and populations would migrate heavily to those moons, originally starting off rather nicely, but soon was pushed beyond what those nations were prepared for. During this time, the South American Federation would expand beyond what they are currently capable of, with many of the colonists living in areas not meant to accommodate for those numbers. Corporations that wanted the money kept funneling people to these locations, and the AE suffered similarly. As such, those colonies would suffer from the resource shortages, and even in later years of this expansion. When they attempted to fix these problems, they largely addressed the larger colonies. Meanwhile, the smaller colonies were neglected by the SAF and the AE. What made matters worse was the Cyrus disease, a local crop plague that afflicted many of the Jovian moons because they shared resources amongst each other. This allowed the disease to spread out quite rapidly and wiped out mostly rice, wheat, and other crops that were very valuable to these nations. This would further limit the already limited resources. So by the 2120s, as the population continued to grow, they suffered more and more, and soon they would all become quite desperate. Kanagishi Station was a AE settlement on Mars. This settlement was among the first settlements established on the Red Planet. This station was rather harsh on its citizens, with its governor being rather harmful overall to them, being abusive in his powers and taxation skills. But initially it wasn't always seen that way, but as the years went on, the citizens would learn what life is like outside of their own station, and began to yearn for the freedoms that they did not have, that they were denied. So they would strive to become part of a different nation. The citizens of Kanagishi were eventually forced to start trying to protest because they wanted to become part of their own nation or become part of another one. As such, the governor would quell these protests via whatever methods resulted in dispersal, so tear gas and the occasional gunfire. So, as a result, the citizens would actually become more resilient to fight this regime than docile. Eventually, the military would be deployed against the citizens and massacred around 4,000 citizens, according to the AE. Meanwhile, the SAF projected around 12,000 were killed, and the UEC projected to be closer to around 16,000 people were killed during these violent 117 days. But in the end, Kanegishi would never fully leave the minds of the AE, as they would remember what would happen if they chose freedom over complete compliance. This would eventually sow the seeds of the future rebellions. I won't be going into near as much detail as I did in the actual Colonial War video itself, so I'll cover some of the basics so it's not quite so hammered down with all the extra details. So, the Colonial War officially went hot April 14th, 2123, following repeated skirmishes between the people of the SAF and the AE, which led to the governments becoming increasingly more hostile and involved in these issues as it became more apparent to society. The war began when a band of SAF rebels who were desperate enough would assault an AE food plant and kill multiple security guards on April 14th, and later the AE would strike back, bombing an SAF city where they likely originated. The SAF would respond by sending countless troops to fight back, as not only were rebels killed, but numerous citizens were also killed as well, who were completely uninvolved in this conflict. The war continued to escalate, with many skirmishes across the Jovian moons and some around Saturn, and other moon colonies within the solar system, including firebombing and minor space engagements. One such battle of importance was the Battle of Izanami. This battle was in particular quite brutal, with the SAF deploying many troops via starships, driving along the ground with space transports, driving right up to the domed city, breaking in and killing many AE citizens when they broke in using the airlock systems. And because of the hull breach, many of the people who were right there, the airlock or around it, were all killed almost within maybe a handful of minutes due to the vacuum of space. This battle would continue on for another 4 weeks thereafter. However, the overall war would come to a crashing halt in 2126 when Fleet Marshal Wyatt Ashkai would intervene with the Upnik and force both parties to kind of reflect and realize neither one of them truly wanted to be wiped out or incur further debts between each other. So they begrudgingly ended the war. According to the records department of the UEC, 400,866 SAF citizens were killed, along with 1.7 million people injured, and 501,779 AE citizens were killed, and 1.2 million were injured during this course of this 3-year war. And by the end, the nations were forced to separate to prevent similar conflicts along the Jovian moons. The early days of interstellar colonization period were similar to when they first moved to the Jovian moons and a little bit beyond. The first human interstellar colony was known as Fandigo 3, which later became named New Babylon, and was first colonized by the Unified Earth colonies in 2134. They settled in a settlement known as New Capua. Other nations would begin to spread amongst the stars as well, settling on planets like Mesada, Planet New England, Orion 5, Harmonfaus, Malika, New Constantinople, Sidoria, and many more as they continued to settle across the stars. This would be one of the more peaceful moments for the other nations because they had room to breathe once more and time to set up new colonies for themselves. But again, they were not always prepared for the other spots, leading to the eventual problems in the future, such as overpopulation and rapid growth. But for the most part, these colonies would be seen as the new beginnings for mankind, moving beyond the same problems of the solar system and going to places never seen before. Usually, colonies would need time to set up in order to do some research on some of these Goldilocks planets, learning about flora, fauna, and understand the planet's diseases and other issues that were present when they were settling. By the time they settled, the planets were well cataloged by drones and other machinery. During this time, however, a terrorist group on Earth would become infamous for bombing numerous locations and would be hunted down by the UEC. But the main conflict that would arise was a coup d'etat on Fandigo 3 in 2143, which would later spread to other planets such as Fandigo 4, Meseta, and planet New England, leading to the creation of the Confederation of Planets. This coup would start over a supposed operation known as Operation Purification, which meant the UEC was planning to annihilate the other nations and assume one world control and kill billions as a result. And because of this, they wanted to break away from this and open the world's eyes to what the UEC were planning. However, supposedly the UEC blocked them from transmitting to other nations. The Mongolian campaign followed these terrorist strikes performed by the Knights of Kruger. They were a mercenary group later turned into a terrorist group radicalized by the notion of the UEC being a cancer to this world because of their capitalist affiliations. As mentioned, they performed many bombings on numerous locations to send a message they were serious before they pulled back to their allies, the Asian Pacific Empire. At 2147, the UEC would invade the AE, territory of Mongolia, deploying thousands of troops to hunt down the Knights of Kruger. This would spark numerous engagements inside the AE. While working there, they discovered numerous camps of Mongolian citizens who were being held captive and were considered weak and capitalist pigs who were put into re-education camps for the betterment of the AE. This would lead to more investigating into the AE and put a prime target on the Knights of Kruger. And by 2152, the AE would pull out of the major conflict, fearing total and absolute war with the UEC, and would give up the Knights of Kruger and the Mongolian guerrillas who refused to give up. The UEC would track them down to the final stronghold within the Iriday Zoo Monastery, which was converted into a war outfit to fit the Krugers' needs. Kruger was eventually killed in the final raid, and the UEC was backed by the AE, who provided intel and helped the UEC box in Kruger to prevent his escape. This unusual event would lead to a treaty in which the chairman of the AE presented the UEC president with one of Kruger's pistols, which he then accepted, ending the war between them and eliminating the Knights of Kruger as a threat to Earth. Following the coup and the end of the Mongolian campaign in November of 2153, the Confederation of Planets would assault a UEC vessel that stopped in the Fandigo system, unaware of the conflict between the TCP and the UEC. They were attacked by TCP heavy cruisers, massacring many of the citizens on board in a brutal manner due to the belief that the UEC ship was actually housing UEC soldiers. They also imprisoned many of the surviving citizens in various brutal camps. UEC research would reveal that Meseta and Planet New England held majority of the TCP's military. As a result, the UEC would strike there first to weaken them. They launched various attacks in 2154 with a large strike force. Meseta would surrender in 2158 and Planet New England in 2159. The following year would see the invasion of Fandigo 4 beginning in October, with a new batch of Cosmic Rangers would be deployed during this conflict. During the campaign, however, traitors within the Cosmic Ranger ranks were discovered. Said traitors would also divulge a lot of information about the UEC's inner workings to help the TCP succeed in their little rebellion. The battle between these two nations were often quite bloody. However, without a doubt, the UEC would win this war because they had the resources, the manpower, and more of a will to do so. Meanwhile, the TCP was continuing to suffer from internal problems, such as nation members or high-ranking officials were often believing that Operation Purification was mere fiction, and the only reason they joined was to separate from the UEC and pursue their own political aims. They were once members of the UEC and were rather low on the political totem pole, but now, as a new member of a new faction, they were under new ideals. They could be something far more than they were ever underneath the UEC. However, in 2161, the TCP managed to break away a small fleet and send it straight towards planet Sidoria, another UEC settlement. This would begin the Battle of Sidoria City, which was a very deadly battle, for many Sidorian citizens were killed, and would be the final straw for the UEC to stop holding back and to send in everything they can to finish off the TCP because, well, they attacked their own settlement, and it's a little bit more than just a small coup d'etat. In 2161, they began operations on New Babylon and hunt down many of the high-ranking officials within the TCP government and tore it down from within. They took down general after general, leading to the TCP being ripped apart limb from limb throughout the 2161 and 2162, and the eventual capture of New Babylon altogether. The last aspect of the war was with the PNFS King Arthur. It left Earth in an attempt to strike the UEC capital to destroy it finally, but the UEC managed to intervene using their own cosmic rangers and some heavy cruisers and took down the King Arthur January 1st, 2163, officially ending the war and destroying the TCP. Around 8 million UEC soldiers were killed, and around 10 million citizens were either injured or more, who were civilian contractors and such, and around 67 million TCP soldiers were killed, and the majority of the soldiers in the TCP military, though, surrendered. The Battle of New Azalon was a major conflict held in, you guessed it, New Azalon. The planet was colonized in 2149 by the SAF, and in 2151 the UAC also colonized it. Both nations began shipping large number of citizens to the planet, colonizing it over time. The SAF would use New Azalon as a large mining operation, stripping the planet of its valuable resources and sending them to the major SAF colonies. And on the planet, the UAC would discover a large titanium deposit in the Gakarana region. Soon enough, the two nations would fight over this large deposit, and later the war expanded beyond it, with the SAF working to try to take over that part of the planet. So why even share the resources? The war was rather bloody, with both nations using chemical warfare and other methods to kill each other. Not many civilians would be spared either. This would further fuel the flames of hatred for this conflict too. Unfortunately, the war would eventually fizzle out on the political spectrum compared to the citizens who still wanted blood. That's because the resources being used to fuel this war were not being replaced by the mines on New Azalon. As such, the SAF would push for peace with the UAC, and they're willing to lend a large sum of land, including many major titanium deposits and other valuable resources, to end this conflict. The UAC was willing to accept this and signed the peace treaty January 7, 2177, and officially ended the war January 11, 2177. But as I stated, this war was not officially over in the people's mind and would eventually sow the seeds of societal hatred for one another. Even if the governments no longer wanted the blood, the citizens never forgot nor forgave each other, and small conflicts would continue across the planet. However, no official government action would be taken after January 7th. 250,000 soldiers were listed as KIA, while 500,000 were listed as WIA, and 1.6 million citizens were listed as KIA for the SAF, along with 4 million listed as WIA. And the UAC suffered 280,000 soldiers killed in action, 3 million citizens killed in action, 110,000 soldiers wounded in action, and 8 million citizens were wounded. The Universal Freedom Party was a political party created within the UEC. These so-called intellectuals grew weary of the world, seeing the conflicts that constantly encompass mankind outside of the UEC, and made them believe the UEC would be the best solution for the world, and wanted to give the citizens of the other nations something to look forward to, like freedom, justice, and more would begin to work towards this common goal, preparing the UEC to one day become the dominant power. And this party would give the citizens of the UEC a glimmer of hope that they can be the ones to save mankind, because mankind is seemingly approaching the apocalypse, and they needed to stop it before it could happen and reduce mankind to extinction. And soon it became the dominant political party across the UEC, with everyone pushing for the UEC to spread its wealth and prosperity to save mankind from its approaching damnation. Crops are one of mankind's lifebloods in order to feed themselves, especially when they leave their home planet and move to worlds beyond. Throughout the South American Federation, the United African Conglomerate, and the Asian Pacific Empire, and even some of the poorer parts of the unified Earth colonies, settlements were often struck by a crop disease that often afflicted numerous plants. Some of these plants were rice, wheat, corn, that were all affected by a new strain of rice blast, which is often infest fields of these crops. This is a fungus called Magna Porthae oryzae. However, due to time and also unintentional food evolution, the fungus would become much more potent than it was during the 21st century. The UEC began working on genetically modifying foods to become resistant to this fungus. However, many people believe the fungus was actually modified by someone intentionally and intentionally released into these worlds, which explains why it's extremely infectious and very lethal across numerous plants. Some even believe the UEC was actually the cause of it, because they were not nearly as afflicted as badly as the other three. Symptoms included diamond or spindle-shaped spots on the leaves with gray or white centers and brown borders. The disease caused neck rot, node infection, leaf collar rot. Infected fields appeared burnt, with severe cases showing whiteheads or poor grain filling. Around 65 to 75% of the harvest yield is usually ruined by this devastating crop plague, which you may be able to think about and assume that mankind can work around it using animals and also beef up the amount of food they can eat, such as animal products. However, due to the ever-growing food wars, animal products were often much scarcer and on a higher demand for high-protein food, which increased during combat-related scenarios. So often, the smaller colonies that had a very few animals would suffer and resort to eating insects. As such, many people would eventually grow tired of eating these insects after previously eating foods, and would desire foods beyond just insect-based protein blocks. As such, insects became a popular food source, but not nearly as desirable as other foods, especially when you've lost access to foods you were previously eating on a regular basis. However, on certain planets, local ecological system diseases and bacteria often seem to devastate the known edible insect species. Some worlds also hosted cordyceps-like fungi, which resulted in bug species that were used for food supplies, often being very hard to keep alive on these foreign planets. This made survival all the more difficult, but not impossible. Corporations will also heavily tax those foods that were better withstanding the deadly crop plague, and later gain a foothold in other food industries to exploit these problems to make more money. But all was not lost. Those who wish to survive will survive, even if they must use animal blood to get extra protein in their diet. As you can imagine, espionage ran rampant within these four nations, including high rates of paranoia that the other nations could be orchestrating things behind the scenes, including those who believed the UEC had the capabilities of entirely replacing somebody, using nano machinery to replace their face and conducting investigations into those people to replace them. But nothing was ever discovered to officially corroborate those statements. But what is known is that the three nations involved in the War of Resources began spying and sabotaging each other, including the Sector 13, which is the UEC's intelligence branch, was secretly assisting those nations behind the scenes using their own tech to bridge the gap between them. But information was kept rather secretive in the Sector 13's involvement, so it's unknown what's true and what isn't. As you can imagine, paranoia was running rampant amongst these three broken nations. Some of it was seeded by their own government, while others believed it was seeded by the UEC interfering. Paranoia, as previously stated, stemmed from presence of spies amongst everyone. Those who could impersonate them had their faces reconstructed to look like previous individuals. As such, people were paranoid about others. Many believe the UEC were even controlled by aliens. That's why they've been manipulating and creating things to bring mankind to their knees so that they would be susceptible to alien invasion. Other aspects of paranoia included the belief that the UEC was run entirely by aliens and that they were performing an experiment to see how far mankind could be pushed before they broke. Other paranoia stemmed from the Asian Pacific Empire and their communist views. It began to spread throughout the UAC and the SAF due to those nations having poorer economic systems, and the citizens began viewing communism as a rather viable option because the other economic systems that were presented large class disparities. Meanwhile, the Asian Pacific Empire, there was no such thing. So communism was often feared because of it, and it could bring the end to nations because the common people would turn against the government and try to overthrow it. On June 2nd, 2179, numerous UAC mining vessels moved to the Malta star system due to rumors of valuable resources within the Maltan asteroid belt. These vessels were not sanctioned by the UAC and went out there of their own accord. 14 vessels arrived in the system at sometime on June 2nd, and they were quickly detected by the Asian Pacific Empire. They were identified as hostile vessels, and numerous vessels were dispatched to engage them directly. Upon learning of their origins, they would present the declaration of war against the UAC for encroaching on their territory and breaching territorial boundaries. The UAC would respond to the AE's hostility and brutality of its UAC citizens, dispatching their own large fleet to engage the Maltan Defense Fleet. The official UAC fleet would arrive June 6, and later the fighting would continue, and the AE would dispatch a much larger fleet of 400 vessels arriving June 8th, and the battle would be quite gruesome thereafter, resulting in the UAC's naval command in the area being completely wiped out and crushed. The war wrapped up June 9, 2179, because the UAC feared total annihilation and signed a peace treaty and fled the war, paying the AE trillions of dollars in damages. The casualties of this brief battle was the UAC lost 3.5 million soldiers, 4,800 civilian sailors, and the AE lost 2.1 million soldiers in this brief conflict. The Outer Colony War began suddenly and deliberately with a resource standoff between the SAF and the UAC settlers on planet Sarah. It was over food. The SAF had a much larger population and more resources, and due to inefficient communication with the main UAC nation and lack of budgeting, The UAC settlement effectively functioned as a standalone nation rather than a colony. When fighting began to break out due to famine and lack of food, the UAC military rapidly deployed itself to the site and indiscriminately killed even their own people. And when the SAF reinforcements arrived, it escalated further into something far worse. Because of Planet Sarah limited communication to the outside world, the UACWS MOGAD would be sent to report this sudden conflict on Sarah after the war continued to escalate and falter in the favor of the SAF military forces. Afterward, the UAC would gather a larger fighting force to arrive, dropping them off, gave them 14 large warships in the spring of 2188. In April 2189, the war began to come to a close following the battle in orbit, with warships clashing in a large orbital battle. Meanwhile, below on the surface, the Battle of Morai Pass would begin and last until October of 2190. It was the largest and longest battle of the war. After the bloody battles continued, peace talks began as the war began to escalate due beyond just Sarah. However, the last battle occurred December 22nd to December 30th, 2190, and the war officially concluded October 11th, 2191 with the Treaty of Sarah. Due to ever-expanding corporate industry because of mankind's heavy reliance on these corporations, so as such corporations would grow in power across numerous star systems, including increasing taxation on the foods that many other nations really relied on. And they were using them to help survive, including insects and livestock to profit off the crisis, while other corporations would work on perfecting a crop that could withstand this dangerous crop plague. Other corporations saw the ever-growing wars and chaos in the human colonies and began to militarize themselves, creating small corporate armies regulated by some of the nation's rules, including the UAC, which developed its own rules and regulations to prevent corporate takeover. However, these regulations do not prevent corporations from militarizing or preparing for engagements with one another. April of 2190 would see the worst outbreak of the soaring crop plague across the Asia-Pacific Empire territory, ravaging most of the crops among many Asia-Pacific Empire planets. Later, the disease would also cause a much worse outbreak on the SAF and UAC territory, respectively, causing a massive famine rapidly spreading across those nations. Many of the planetary colonies were poorly produced within the SAF, UAC, and the Asia-Pacific Empire, with all those nations only investing just enough in each one to get them started. Though these colonies were largely left to fend for themselves, as a result, many would soon starve. By June of 2190, the Asian-Pacific Empire civilians would begin to seek food by any means necessary, stealing from those who surrounded them. Unfortunately, this would start on planet New Carthage, where all three nations afflicted by this great plague would begin to fight amongst each other. The War of Resources was a war between the AE, UAC, and the SAF that served as the final straw before the last conflict. The war was mostly amongst these three, with each of them dealing with internal suffering and strife, including food riots, political strife, and assassinations. At the same time, they were engaged in skirmishes along the borders. The nations were carelessly overexpanding, which led to this war. Their citizens starved as the nations fought over scarce resources, while leaders ignored the conflicts and dismissed them as mere rebellions driven by hatred. As the conflicts progressed, the UEC citizens called for intervention, and eventually they refused, but soon they kept insisting to intervene. This all would change in 2201 when Paul Winchester became the president. He was the first Universal Freedom Party member to become president and rapidly militarized the nation in preparation for what was to come. Feeling as if there was nothing more to do, the UEC would join the War of Resources. But it would be the beginning of a whole new war, the Unification War. The UEC and many other citizens of the nations would become tired of all these conflicts, tired of the lies, and would do whatever they can to survive. So the UEC decided to destroy the other nations by whatever means necessary, and began a rather totalitarian lifestyle in this. They began eliminating and arresting those who opposed this option and declared the other nations unfit, for they were unstable and they were unable to make proper nations. Despite having many decades of time to try to make something out of themselves, all they did was repeat the same mistakes again and again. In the announcement, Paul Winchester said the following to the nations before officially declaring war.
Today marks the end of one era, flooded with filth of some of us call humans. That era is to be put to past. A new era of humanity is rising from the husk of the old. With the UEC at the front of it, the peak of prosperity, the very essence of wealth. As chairman of the UPN and president of the UEC, I made the executive order to rid this world of this old era, using this to usher in a new and clean one, cleansing it through blood of the old. The world is plagued by that world, and the UEC is a cure for this, to purge those that do not accept this era. I declare that you are the plague, each and every one of you. Run away in fear. My armies will steamroll you, leaving you in the wake of the past. Do not be disquieted by the actions, citizens of the UEC. This is an era that will result in a better world not plagued by constant war and constant pain. We will be united under the flag, the pride of the UEC, to end all the suffering that has been created by the divisions of the world. The great rapture has begun. Run away or join the cause that will lead to humanity's victory. The old era will be we will purge the parasites.
In conclusion, these are the circumstances that led to the Unification War. I'm choosing to keep the Unification War details rather obscure for as long as I'm running the TCW universe. What I can say is that the war was quite devastating and led to the other three nations were brought down by the UEC's superior might and technology, as well as their own hubris, resulting in billions of deaths over the course of 13 years. This war changed humanity forever, all uniting underneath one flag. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. What should we explore next time? But for now, let me know in the comments. And that is all for today. Peace out.